We'll need your help in electing Democrats up and down the ticket. Voting this Tuesday only enables the Republicans in their quest to elect Donald Trump again. Your vote makes a difference in November, not this Tuesday.
Well, that sounds a lot like the US President Joe Biden. It's in fact a deep fake, and it was sent to voters in New Hampshire earlier this year, urging them not to take part in upcoming primaries. Artificial intelligence is posing a new threat to elections. It's making it much easier to create fake content that looks and sounds increasingly credible. So how are voters to know what's fake and what's real? And what steps are being taken to ensure that we're not being duped during an election campaign? I'm keen to explore this in an Australian context with the man who runs elections in this country, Electoral Commissioner Tom Rogers. I'm David Spears on Ngunnawal Country at Parliament House in Canberra. Welcome to Insiders on Background. Tom Rogers, welcome to you. Great to have a chat. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, David.
So how worried are you about deep fakes being used to, influence people during election campaigns?
Look, we're seeing a little bit of that overseas. It's concerning, and I think we'd be foolish to think we're immune from that here. It's a new technology. It's being deployed. We've seen all sorts of things. I think you're aware, David. We've seen some avatar production in places like Indonesia and India. I think at the last Indonesian election, even President Suharto made an appearance on TV. So to think that...
And it's a fake.
It's a fake. It's an avatar.
Right.
So I think we just need to be aware of the fact that this is coming downstream. We'd be foolish to think that we're going to be immune from it.
And just perhaps a technical point, but sometimes AI can be used deliberately by even a political leader. But we're talking here about where it's a fake.
Or not declared. Now, I don't know about the President Suharto one, whether that was declared or not, but I think there's two very different things we're talking about here, where AI might be used lawfully, declared, and other uses where it may not be declared and designed to confuse electors.
Yeah, what I've heard examples of is where a politician might want to really micro-target a message using people's names or suburbs, and sure, you might use AI to be able to do that a lot more efficiently than recording the same message a thousand times.
Also even translating your message into different languages in your voice, though.
Yeah, but when we talk about not being authorised, the use of someone's image or voice or whatever, you are worried this might happen in Australia?
I think it's a distinct possibility. We've been talking about it. I appeared at the Senate Select Committee on Artificial Intelligence the other week, and I've made the comment that we are not really set up for that. I can tell you right now that within the AEC, we don't have the technical capability to detect AI-based messaging. It would take a huge amount of resourcing to do that. So I'm not sure we're set up for that at the moment, and I don't think that the electoral legislation is set up for that either.
So there's two things there. We don't have any laws at the moment that make it illegal to create a fake of Anthony Albanese or Peter Dutton or whoever it is. It's not against the law?
Well, this is a really complex issue for me, David. I'm about to sound like a nerd for a moment, but
Please go ahead.
I don't want to stray into the area of truth in advertising here.
Yeah,
so
I'll come to that.
We might come to that. So quite often in political campaigns already there's mis and disinformation where Party A might say something about Party B, and what we say is that's a matter for the parties to sort out. I'm really focused on protecting the electoral integrity of the system. So where there are messages that are designed to confuse voters.
Well, this could be a message about when the election is, or where you vote, or how you
don't need to vote.
That's right.
That's right. They could
mis or disinformation about the voting process. But are you saying that's not against the law at the moment?
The only part of the Act really that would apply here is Section 329, which is a really narrowly cast section of the Act about confusing voters about effectively the act of voting.
Right.
It's a really narrow piece of the legislation, and it wouldn't cover what you're talking about.
So if I was to put out something that said, people under 25 can't vote, everyone else vote on Tuesday, and that's clearly wrong.
We would take action on that because that would be confusing the elector. But if, for example, David, someone cloned you and you jumped on and made some sort of statement about one of the candidates, about their platform, that would not be covered by the Electoral Act. And that would certainly be confusing voters. Not that I'm suggesting, David, someone's going to do that for you.
No, let's hope that doesn't happen. So is that something we do need to legislate, do you think?
There's two parts of this. So there's regulation and then there's education. And there's been some examples where some countries have regulated. So I might get part of this wrong, but South Korea, for example, my understanding is they put in a piece of legislation that banned AI-generated political content 90 days before their election. So that's the regulation piece. But having said that, they still detected 400 pieces of AI-generated content at the election. The second part of that, which is what I think is an urgent requirement, is we need to give our citizens the skills they need to survive in this world. They need better digital literacy skills. That's something I think we should be focusing on urgently.
What does that look like?
Education campaigns, awareness campaigns. Now, we're doing a little bit at the election. We run a campaign at election time called Stop and Consider. We've researched it heavily. We're getting about 20% recognition with the community. It costs 2 cents per elector. It's highly effective. I'd love to tell you that I just came up with this idea, David, but we shamelessly stole it from the Swedes.
Right.
They ran a national campaign, and apparently this sounds great in Swedish, but it was, if it makes you angry, it's probably fake. And this is our version of that campaign, and it's designed to get citizens to think about the source of information, not the facts, but where it comes from, who's generating it, whether it might be real. We need to roll that out nationally. We need to do it urgently, and I've been on record as saying that as well.
There's a really interesting line, though. If it makes you angry, it's probably fake. Is the idea that the more extreme content you see, you really need to double check whether it's authentic.
Well, our research of our campaign, Stop and Consider, shows that people actually react to it. They say, oh, right. And a large number of electors said that when they read that, it helped them consume information differently. I really think we need to focus on that. Now, we do as much as we can with education. In any case, you might know, David, down the hill here at the Museum of Australian Democracy, we get 100,000 kids a year through that centre to look at our exhibit to learn about elections. We're just digitising some of that content at the moment, so we have an even bigger reach into communities that can't come to Canberra. We're doing a range of things, but as a community, I think we urgently need a national digital literacy campaign.
Well, that's a message to the government, isn't it? That they need to get cracking on that pretty soon if an election's coming up within the next 12 months.
It is, and I think, and I've been talking about that publicly for quite a while, and I do know that people are looking at this issue, but it's for me an obvious and urgent need.
The other part of what you mentioned there is the capability to police this stuff, and I think you said it's an enormous requirement. But is that something the AEC would want to do?
No.
Right. Now explain why.
Well, we would want access potentially. So it depends. If, let's say that regulation was passed requiring parties to, I don't know, either watermark artificially AI-generated content or perhaps even declare AI-generated content. Let's say that legislation was passed, and let's say, David, that you produced some sort of ad, you were a candidate, and another candidate complained that you hadn't put that authorisation on and that you had generated that material using AI, and I came to you and you said, well, no, I didn't. Well, I'd have no way of, at the moment, of proving that unless we have access to some sort of capability. It's complex, though, because it's moving so quickly.
Yeah.
It's kind of an arms race between detection and generation, and I think we would need access to that if that regulation was passed, rather than us having it, because I don't want to get involved in that process.
So would it need to be some other independent agency or body that would do that?
Well, and now we're veering back into the truth, the truth issue. I've been very clear saying that the AEC should not be the arbiter of truth at election time.
And just explain why, because obviously you must get a lot of people saying, why can't the Electoral Commission do something about this misinformation or disinformation or lies in political advertising?
We get that all the time. We get it online, a lot of people saying, I've just seen this message from a candidate. It's clearly wrong, and why aren't you doing something about that?
Yeah.
Because at election time, truth is in the eye of the beholder quite often, and one person's truth is another person's mistruth, particularly when it comes to party material. And if we started to pronounce on that, it would ruin our neutrality. We're really well trusted by the Australian community, David. 9 out of 10 Australians tell us they trust the AEC to count the votes the way that they're cast. And
if you were to become the arbiter of truth in an election campaign,
that would plummet. The first time that we say that a candidate's effectively lying, you can imagine the reaction of that candidate and the candidate's supporters. So why we focus on the electoral process and defending the electoral process, that's a really important part of what we do. But that bit...
not for you. Not for you. But I've got to ask.
For the agency that may end up...
Well, I was going to ask. I mean, you obviously have an interest, as we all do, in the integrity of our elections.
Absolutely.
Can you think of an agency that could do this job?
David, do you wish me to get hate mail at the end of this particular activity from another agency head? Can I just say it's...
But we need someone doing it, do you agree?
Yes. I think it's a matter that Parliament's looking at right now. There are polarised views on this about whether a government agency should be in charge of determining truth. I do think the bit that we do on the electoral process is really important. The rest of it really is a matter for Parliament. And I think...
well, it particularly came up after the Voice referendum last year. Yes, there was misinformation and disinformation, but no body calling that out or doing something about it.
That's right. And I know, and quite often, and I get it too, citizens, whenever they see anything with election in front of it, think, well, why isn't the AEC sorting that out? And it's just that we need to think about the integrity and trust in the process. I've looked globally at other election management bodies where their sort of trust quotient has collapsed for a whole range of reasons. And I look at us and we've managed to retain the trust of the community. We've done a whole range of things to do that. I'd like to retain that trust. I know it sounds a bit hokey, but I always say that elections are actually about the loser rather than the winner. Elections have got to be run in the way that the loser and the loser's supporters think it's fair. With one exception, which I won't go into, I've never had a winner come to me to say, I'm unhappy with the way that you ran that election. It's actually running it in a way that people think, yeah, that was fair. And there was no malfeasance or no other issue. And that bit about truth, about what candidates are saying, I think would ruin that.
I think it's a really interesting point about the loser respecting the process, and you don't have to look far beyond the United States to see the trouble that can be created if an election defeat isn't accepted. Just before we move on, you do actually have next week a summit or a conference being held in Canberra. You talk about sharing information and swapping notes with other countries and commissions on what they're doing. Just tell me a bit about that.
Yeah, really important. We learn a lot from our peer practitioners. We've been running a thing called the Canberra Series on Electoral Integrity. It's an AEC idea. We've had 40 countries participating virtually for 3 seminars. We've had presentations from around the world. Next week, here in Canberra, we've got the Canadian Commissioner, New Zealand Commissioner, Swedish Commissioner, many of the Australian states and territories, and some of our colleagues from the region, including Fiji, in a room talking about all sorts of issues connected with electoral integrity. And that will include mis and disinformation.
And deep fakes.
And what others are doing about that issue.
And what about this, just one more on this, the social media companies? We tend to talk about them a lot at the moment, but on this aspect in particular, would you like to see them doing more about deep fake political or election content?
I'm very conscious of not becoming a target here with social media companies. I don't want the eye of Sauron to light upon the AEC, but we work where we can with the social media companies. We've got a relatively good relationship. That doesn't mean we always agree.
With all of them?
With some social media companies. The 2022 election, we had a protocol in place. It wasn't particularly revolutionary, but it did provide some certainty about how we would work together. That's since lapsed effectively, and we're working with those companies to do as much as we can. We have expectations that when the Electoral Act is breached, that they take action. We have found overall that they are now less likely to remove content, and I understand why. There's a prevailing view that moderation occurs in the public square rather than a government agency having content removed. And that whole thing is fascinating, David, about what happens when stuff is removed in any case, because some of these conspiracies are really that are mentioned online, really deeply held beliefs by people. It's not just they're doing it to play around. Some of them really deeply believe it. So when the material is removed, sometimes it has the reverse effect. They say
it can be a red flag.
You're doing that because it's true. We had a live example, 2019, tinfoil hat wearing bonkers conspiracy called the Vote of No Confidence. I don't know whether you remember that, but
no.
It's a whole thing online that if you annotated your ballot paper in a particular way, this is how for those who are listening who believe this conspiracy, I apologise if I get the conspiracy wrong, but if you wrote no suitable candidate to express my will and you crossed out every candidate, the conspiracy read it was a valid vote to sack the government, whatever that means. It was so crazy, and it was advocating for an informal vote. So we started to have it removed as it popped up on social media. One woman in particular was pushing this. And we found that the more we had it removed, people said it must be true, because otherwise you wouldn't take it down.
You wouldn't be taking it down.
And I personally saw ballot papers wasted that way in the count centres with that mark. So we've got to be careful how we do that stuff.
No, absolutely. Is it fair to say X, formerly Twitter, is less cooperative perhaps than other platforms?
I hate to be a bureaucrat here, David, but again, I'm conscious that I don't want to become a target here. There's been a change in the overall environment with social media platforms over the last 2 years. I think 2022 was a high point for us with how we were able to work with those platforms.
Right.
Since then, the landscape has changed across the board.
So you're expecting less cooperation in the coming election?
A very different form of cooperation. We saw some disappointing stuff at the last two elections, the referendum where there were even, I don't want to overblow this, but even vague threats against our staff, which occasionally the platforms decided not to remove, which was very disappointing.
That's pretty disturbing.
Yeah, we've seen a trend where some people going to the polling place. These are particularly conspiracy theorists who believe various things, and film our staff and then put that online, and with the faces of these individuals who are just turning up to do a job. These are quite often temporary staff. That bit worries me deeply. I do know that we're looking at that about what else we might do in that regard as well. But those sorts of things disturb me deeply, and I hesitate to use that hackneyed phrase. It's also un-Australian. We have over 100,000 workers, members of the community, that join us at election time, and it's a difficult job, and they do a great job. We wouldn't survive without them, so we do as much as we can to try and protect those individuals.
Yeah, fair enough. Look, let me move on. The Electoral Commission has been busy, of course, over recent months doing its draft redistributions of electoral boundaries. An extra seat for WA is coming. The draft proposal is for that to be called Bullwinkle. Victoria loses the seat of Higgins. New South Wales loses the seat of North Sydney. Can I just invite you to explain to people how this works? How do you decide why a state's got to lose a seat and which seat has to go?
David, it's a great question, and sometimes people think that we randomly wake up and think this would be a great idea. We just, we'll reshuffle the decks. There's a whole legislative process, so we are absolutely bound by the legislation. If you think about it, the whole process is designed to smooth out numbers around Australia. So broadly speaking, there's equal representation. And effectively 1 year and 1 day after the first sitting day of Parliament, under the law, I have to determine the population of Australia for the purpose of representation, and quite often that will spark a redistribution, as it has done in this case with 3 of the states.
So you take that population, what did you say, 1 year and 1 day?
1 year and 1 day after the first sitting day of Parliament, and if I was to reflect on the first
sometime
July,
in 2022,
something 22, and then I take data from the ABS. We use that data to determine the population of Australia for the purposes of entitlement.
Right.
We then have a look at the states, and in this case, it meant that relative population changes around Australia meant that Western Australia was entitled an additional seat. Victoria and New South Wales lost a seat. So we then start a whole process. One thing to be clear on is it is actually independent of the AEC.
Right.
So sometimes people miss that, but it's really critical to understand. So we actually set up a committee, a redistribution committee. I chair that first part of the process.
Who else is on that
But
committee?
I'm joined by state officials as well. So for each of the states,
Right.
normally it's the State Auditor General, the State Surveyor General, the State Manager from the AEC, and we're all supported by Secretariat provided by the AEC. We take suggestions from the public. We take comments on those suggestions. We then sit down with the ABS data, and there's various parameters, which I won't go into here, numerical parameters designed to smooth out that process. We have to produce a solution that fits within those parameters, and then we publish that. And then...
Which is where we're at now. You've published
right
the draft.
now, and then people go, oh, that's great or not great, depending on how you sit on that process. And then 2 other members join, the retired judge, who's the part-time chair of the Electoral Commission, and the Australian statistician. We form the Augmented Electoral Commission.
Right.
Then we do a second phase where we consider suggestions on the proposed redistribution. We look at comments on those. We do public hearings in each of the states. Then we consider that detail. We produce the final redistribution, and that's the end of that process.
And that comes in, is it late September, early October?
We will finish that in around late September, early October. And it's interesting. People say, how do you do it? My colleague, the Irish Electoral Commissioner, says it's a war. It's a battle between demography and geography. And that's a very accurate way of thinking about it. Each of the states is different. There are features in each of the states that make it complex. So if we think of Victoria, the Yarra, Port Phillip Bay, New South Wales, the harbour and the mountains and the coast are huge restrictions on what we can do. So it's a complex process.
Yeah, it's difficult. And
yeah.
look, we do end up, though, with electorates. I think at the moment, quite a few of them have more than 120,000 constituents. I think one that I looked at, is it MacArthur, has more than 140,000?
I'd have to check that. I'm not sure about that.
Okay, anyway.
The average is, 120,000. I think
About 10 years ago, that was around 100 or just under 100.
Yeah,
it's certainly grown.
On average, yeah.
The question I'm getting to is, do we need more electorates? Do we need to expand the size of Parliament? When you look around the world, talk to your counterparts, are our electorates too heavily populated?
I do have a view on that, but I'm so conscious that this is a matter for Parliament.
Right.
I'm a strong believer in democracy, David. I otherwise wouldn't be doing this role, and I do think citizens have the right to access their local MP. It's really important, and the bigger those seats get,
the more difficult that
gets. I think people may or may not be aware that the average size is about 120,000. I think the biggest seats in South Australia, some of those are 129,000. The smallest number of electors are in Tasmania. People may or may not be aware that each of the original states has a constitutional guarantee of a minimum of 5 seats. So in Tasmania, I think the average is about 89,000 because
you can't reduce the number of seats.
That's right. So it's a complex issue, and what I'm very proud of is the fact that it's truly done here in a non-partisan way, involving bureaucrats rather than politicians making the final decisions.
But ultimately, it's politicians who have to decide to expand the size of Parliament and have more electorates.
Exactly right.
If they did so, though, it might help our democracy.
I think that's actually occurring right now. I think when I was at Senate Estimates a couple of weeks ago, the Special Minister of State, Minister Farrell, said that they are considering looking particularly at representation in the ACT to see whether that would be expanded. I know there are very polarised views on that. But for me, I think the principle is that citizens deserve to be able to access their local MP.
Yes, and representation from the ACT is a whole other discussion. But look, just on the timing here of the redistributions. So the final redistribution has to come, your final declaration on the redistributions comes late September or early October. What happens if an election is called before then?
Well, so just for the record, sometimes people think I have a hotline to understand when the election's going to be, and I don't.
You don't? Okay.
I thought, David, you might have more information than I do.
I wish.
Yeah. So with that as a background, if there is an election before we finish the declaration here for the redistributions, we have to do a thing we've never done before called a mini redistribution.
Right. Never done before.
Never done before.
Okay.
And it's slightly complex, so if you're interested, I'll just
definitely interested
talk through that process. So in those states that are losing a seat,
New South Wales and Victoria, yep,
we find the 2 seats that are contiguous with the lowest combined number of electors, not population, but electors.
Right.
And we immediately smash them together.
Okay, so which two are they in, Victoria?
Well, if I look at and this is at today's date because these statistics change. So what that would mean in Victoria is that you would end up with the seat of Chisholm Higgins.
So Chisholm and Higgins have the smallest number of electors. So you put them together.
And you give it the name of...
And it has to be called Chisholm Higgins. For this election.
That's right.
Right. And
now, I stress that's based on the statistics I've got today.
Okay, that might change. People might move into another suburb.
That's right.
And New South Wales, what would it be there?
So the same thing happens there. That's a really odd one. If that happened, again, we're not at estimates here, David, so this is my quick take on it, right? So if I'm wrong, I'll sort of clean it up later on. But I'm pretty sure I'm right. But we would end up with the very oddly named and oddly positioned seat of Warringah Wentworth.
Ooh.
So we'd be going across the harbour.
So an electorate that covers the harbour.
That's exactly right. And that means the other electorates would remain unchanged.
Okay.
So it's an interesting process.
And then WA, I've got to ask too, because they're meant to gain a seat. How does that work if you have to do one of these snap redistributions?
So it's almost the reverse. We find the 2 seats, contiguous seats with the largest combined number of electors.
Yep.
We split them apart.
And which 2 are they?
Well, you would end up with a division of Durack, a division of Hasluck, and a new division of Durack-Hasluck in the middle of those two.
Wow, big. So you turn 2 seats into 3 and just give the one in the middle the combined name, Durack-Hasluck.
What could go wrong with that, with those names? So, so that's the process. It's interesting though how we do that redistribution process. You might be interested. People say, why did you pick those seats to go to delete? Interestingly, for New South Wales, we had, from members of the public and political parties, 21 different suggestions about deleting various seats. Now,
Which seat should go, yeah.
You won't be surprised, David, that political parties very rarely advocate for the abolition of their own seats. And some of
What
those,
a shock.
Yeah, unbelievable. Some of those suggestions have no other supporting information, just get rid of that seat.
Right.
So when we filter...
They don't put any sort of statistics around it.
Get rid of that one.
That one, go.
Now, but many people do. They work through it in detail. They have their own logic. But when we had a look in detail at it, we thought that in New South Wales, there were 5 divisions that were serious contenders for abolition. We put this in the report, so it's not news, but Banks, Cunningham, North Sydney, Warringah and Werriwa were all seats we looked at in great detail after we looked at the rest, and we came up in the end with North Sydney.
So what made North Sydney the standout?
Geography versus demography. And when we looked at how the map would play out, to us that made the best sense. So the electors from North Sydney, I don't have the map in front of me, but are moving largely into Bennelong, Berowra, Warringah, etc. There's been a little bit of commentary online, largely pretty good, but people saying, oh my God, there's a guideline that you should avoid abolishing federation seats. That's not actually a guideline at all.
Right, okay.
There is a guide that we use. We keep in mind that if possible, retain the name of federation seats, but only if possible. And there's another guideline that says if you're creating a new seat, don't use a geographic name. So if we'd moved North Sydney as a name, I don't know, to the Central Coast, it would make no sense.
No.
So therefore, that's why we came up with that. In Victoria, just out of interest, there were suggestions to abolish 12 divisions from members of the public, parties and other interested individuals. We looked at 10 in the end that we thought were serious contenders. Aston, Casey, Chisholm, Dunkley, Higgins, Hotham, Kooyong, Maribyrnong, McEwen and Wills. But again, when you start looking at the Yarra, the mountains, the coast, Port Phillip, to us, Higgins was the logical contender.
Okay.
And we looked at quite a lot, like in detail, the demography and the geography of that.
And it's possible with population movement in the next term of Parliament, New South Wales, Victoria might get a seat back.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, the last redistribution. I have now redistributed the whole of Australia at least once, some of the states twice, and a couple, this is the 3rd time. Last time Western Australia went down.
Now
and
it's
now
get ones
back
back.
up.
Yeah, okay.
So
this
it
is
really
cyclical.
just depend on those populations.
And seat names can come back as well.
Absolutely.
How do you choose seat names? I know former prime ministers
yes,
all get one once they're deceased, but
it's all guidelines.
Right.
So we try to find a home for deceased prime ministers. And it sounds a bit morbid, but that's the guideline. And with the recent announcement of the renaming of Cook for both Captain Cook and for the Prime Minister Cook, every deceased Prime Minister has a home. We also then try and provide names for Australians who have provided distinguished service to the country.
Do you have like a list in the drawer of?
We've got a whole range of names that I think every Australian's kind of aware of, but people also make suggestions. And we've changed names previously as a result of suggestions from the community and from political parties. But we can't just rely on that because theoretically people might not put in any suggestions. It is a motive, David. Again, I'm just thinking publicly what's in the report, but the whole time I've done this process, every one of the redistribution committees and the augmented committees, there has only ever been 2 votes in that entire time. And both of those votes were about names, not boundaries.
Right.
And both
so they're more contentious than the boundaries.
Occasionally,
the
they're very
names.
motive, right? For anyone that has ever been, I don't know, on a body corporate or even at the parents and friends committee at your local school, you know that it's hard to get agreement on anything. When you're talking about something emotive, it's difficult.
So
and
what was the vote on? Which name?
Both times was here in the ACT. And it's listed in the report. I don't want to speak on behalf of the committee, even though I chaired that first part of the committee. But so it's sometimes those names can be a very contentious thing, but I think we've done a pretty good job. We've got rid of a couple of names over the years for people that had demonstrable issues.
There's one in Melbourne, wasn't there?
There was. I won't go into the details. There's another one in South Australia.
Where you find something, where attitudes change about a historic figure.
Yeah. And again, the last thing we want is for the AEC to get involved in culture wars.
Yeah.
But where demonstrably, people present evidence that something is wrong. I mean, one of the names in South Australia, I forget which one we deleted earlier on, he'd never even been to Australia, for a start. And
not a great connection to the country.
And not only that, I think he'd actually done some jail time for marrying a 13-year-old.
Oh, dear.
For us,
that's a pretty easy one to put a line through.
That's right.
Look, you don't have the hotline to the Prime Minister on when the election will be, but how much time do you need
to prepare?
Yeah.
I'm sure people understand this, but running an election, not just in Australia but globally, is generally the most complex peacetime logistic event undertaken in the life of that nation. If you think about, we have over 17 million electors, 100,000 workers. It's hugely expensive. We get 4 weeks' notice. It's like setting up a Fortune 500 company in 4 weeks and then dismantling it afterwards. The last federal election, not the referendum, I think we printed 60 million ballot papers using printers all over Australia. All of that has to be done in a secure way. We have to get the ballots back to their home division for counting at the other end, and we're providing voting in 100 of our overseas missions.
But can you do 4 weeks' notice, as in when the writs are issued? That's all the notice.
That's right.
You get all you need.
No one just listen, old boy, get ready. It's coming in a couple of months.
You don't put in the bulk order for little pencils earlier.
So we have some standing orders for stuff that we can do almost up front. But I'm conscious. Someone says to me, "Are you always ready?" We're kind of ready to be ready because the cost involved in being truly ready to deliver at any time is phenomenal. So we do a staged process. We've got a great system. We've got our election readiness system, which helps us get ready and make sure that we're not overspending. Stuff has a shelf life. If you buy even ballot boxes, David, early, that glue has, I think, a 2-year shelf life, and you've got to be careful with that. So there's a whole range of things that we have to look at to make sure that we...
There's a lot of preparation, not to mention the prospect of a snap redistribution if the election, as we've found out, is called or held before you do the final redistribution.
At any time from now, because we've started the redistribution process, we're up to a mini redistribution. Now, again, just like you, David, I listen to what the Prime Minister says, and we sniff the wind.
Read the tea leaves.
And that's where we are.
I'm glad to hear you're ready to roll with 4 weeks' notice. Electoral Commissioner Tom Rogers, it's been great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks very much, David.
Well, we're keen for your thoughts on this conversation, any other suggestions you might have for the podcast as well. Drop us a line. The email address is insiders@abc.net.au. You can rate and review, and please subscribe to the podcast, and we'll be back in your feed next week. And in the meantime, I'll see you Sunday morning for Insiders. Bye for now.